Welcome back to the Diplomatic Lounge. Today I want to talk a bit about the United Nations. Looking back on my professional life, I realized that I've spent a lot of it in those hallowed buildings by the East River in New York City. I entered those halls for the first time in 1985, and I spoke there for the last time in the fall of 2010. In between those dates, the membership had increased tremendously, from the original 51 member states when the UN was founded in 1945-46. It had exploded to about 160 by the time I spoke there first in 1985, and close to 200 when I spoke there for the last time in 2010. Now, obviously, this increasing number of member states has a certain influence on the work that is ongoing. All of those states, close to 200 now, have things to say and do it at some length. And much of your time at the UN, especially during the opening weeks of the General Assembly, each year in September, is just sitting there and listening, taking notes, listening to this endless parade of heads of state, kings, presidents, ministers, who all speak on behalf of a state. What is the state? When you're sitting there, looking around, you start thinking all these diplomats like yourself are representing a government. And a government is also supposed to represent a society. But is that really true? I've worked long enough in non-democratic states, let's say, to understand that there are differences between the state and the society. One of the fictions in non-democratic states, especially in communist states, is that the state and the society coincide. But that's a fiction, or in fact a lie. The state is made up of institutions and should, as we see it in democracies, serve the society. But when you handle the fiction that the state and the society are the same thing, you are in basically for a totalitarian system. This is what happened in the Soviet Union. It's simply not true that the state can fully coincide with the society, because the society is made up of individuals and they each have their own priorities, their own feelings, their own way of life. If the state becomes too invasive, it takes away individual liberty, and we know that. That was, I think, the underlying cause of the death of communism in Europe. And eventually, I think, it will undermine the survival of any non-democratic system. Why? Because the fictions of the state become ever more invasive, and modern life is simply too complicated for the simplistic ideas that systems like communism are based on. Winston Churchill said it at the end of his war memoirs: human society will evolve in so many ways that are simply incomprehensible to a state apparatus. And that is more true than ever. The fact that state and society do not coincide can even be seen in a democratic country like the United States. It's a good turnout in a presidential election when about more than half of the eligible voters come out and cast a ballot. It means that roughly half of the society is not living really within the state structure, but is doing its own thing. Now, it's a libertarian philosophy that finds this a good thing. It is, of course, challenging because we have to behave as humans with certain norms and impose certain restrictions on ourselves. And yet, I think in the long run, the fact that societies can emancipate themselves from states may be a good thing. I was born in Belgium, one of the few countries, I think, where voting is still mandatory. So when there is a national election in Belgium, the picture that emerges in the parliament is a true reflection of the political opinions of the whole country. And yet, because Belgian politics are so complicated, we had long times when there was no functioning government in place, because it takes months, sometimes more than a year, to negotiate coalition governments. And the strange thing is that without a functioning government, Belgium was actually thriving. The economy was going well. There was no civil unrest, no rioting or whatever. I remember during one of those periods, I was consul general in New York, and US journalists started to call me, trying to understand what was going on, because they thought that the period in Belgium without a functioning government was like government shutdown in the United States, which creates an enormous amount of problems. In fact, what the situation in Belgium showed is that the society, in the absence of a working government, was pretty much running itself and doing so in a very responsible and successful way. It's something I hope for to see more frequently in the future. I think non-democratic systems will eventually undermine themselves because, again, their simplistic premises are unfit for the increasing complexity of human society. And when that is not reflected in the evolution of politics, those systems, I think, will in the end undermine themselves. And we will see, or I hope to see, that this phenomenon of the society emancipating itself from the state will be one of the hopeful things in the future of this planet. Thank you, and see you next time.